Imagine coming home to find your house reduced to rubble, and the person who did it is sipping lattes in an HOA office. My sister lost everything: family photos, her dead mother's recipes, even our great-grandmother's wedding ring, because a power-hungry HOA president decided her home violated community standards. But Karen Winters didn't know one crucial detail: I'm the county sheriff, and I was about to turn her little dictatorship into a federal case. You don't bulldoze a sheriff's sister and walk away. But to understand how this demolition site became my crime scene, we need to rewind to that first phone call. Everything destroyed, we walked around the area and found HOA signs posted. There was a big billboard that said "Future Community Garden Coming Soon" with the Pinecrest HOA logo on it. Sarah explained that she never received any notice or warning about this. Nothing in the mail, no emails, no phone calls. They just came and demolished her house while she was away. An old neighbor came over and told us that the HOA president named Karen Winters was behind this. He said Karen became president last year and had been causing problems for any homeowners who didn't fit her ideal mold. I'm actually the county sheriff in the next county over, but I pressed my badge against my leg like a hidden weapon. Karen thought she was dealing with another helpless homeowner. She had no idea this demolition site was about to become a crime scene. I decided not to tell anyone that yet. I wanted to investigate first and find out exactly what happened before revealing who I was. If they knew I was the sheriff, they might immediately get lawyers involved. Don't tell them I'm the sheriff yet, I told Sarah quietly. Let me first go talk to them and see what they have to say for themselves. I was angry, seeing my sister so heartbroken, standing in front of what used to be her home. Someone was going to pay for this, and I was going to make sure justice was served. The next morning, Sarah and I went straight to the HOA office. It was in a small but fancy-looking building, with Pinecrest Homeowners Association written in gold letters on the door. My sister was nervous, but I told her to stay calm and let me do most of the talking. When we walked in, Karen didn't even look up from her manicure. She drawled, examining her nails. We sent notices. My sister's sob cracked the air. You're talking about my wedding album, my dead mother's recipes. Karen finally met our eyes, smiling like a cat with a trapped mouse. I cleared my throat. Excuse me, we need to speak with whoever is in charge of demolition approvals. The woman finally looked up with an annoyed expression. That would be me, Karen Winters, HOA president. Do you have an appointment? Sarah stepped forward. I'm Sarah Johnson. You demolished my house on Maple Street while I was away. I want to know why. Karen's face showed no emotion. She just sighed like we were wasting her time and clicked something on her computer. 742 Maple Street. Yes, that property was in serious violation of our community standards. We sent multiple notices. I never received any notices, Sarah said, her voice shaking. You can't just tear down someone's house. Karen looked at Sarah like she was a child. We absolutely can when the property violates our regulations. Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the HOA agreement clearly states that after 3 violations, the association can take corrective action. Corrective action means fines or maybe forced repairs, not demolishing an entire house, I said firmly. Karen finally seemed to notice me. And you are? I'm Sarah's brother. I'm here to understand how this could possibly be legal. She rolled her eyes. The procedures were followed, the board voted, it's all very proper and by the book. I kept my temper in check. I'd like to see the documentation for these notices and the demolition approval. That's confidential HOA business, Karen said dismissively. Members only. Sarah was getting upset again. You destroyed everything I own, my photos, my grandmother's jewelry, everything. Karen's face hardened. Perhaps next time you'll take HOA violations more seriously. The community has standards that must be maintained. I could feel my badge burning in my pocket, but revealing I was the county sheriff now would just make her defensive. I needed to build a proper case first. We're not leaving until we see those documents, I insisted. Karen stood up. Then I'll have to call security. This is private property, and you're becoming disruptive. Other people in the office were watching now. I put my hand on Sarah's shoulder. We'll go for now, but this isn't over. As we walked out, Karen called after us. The community garden will be lovely, much better than that eyesore. In the car, Sarah broke down crying again. How can she get away with this? She asked. I started the engine. She won't. Trust me. She has no idea who she's dealing with. I'm going to make sure she faces every consequence possible for what she's done. After that infuriating meeting, I knew I needed to use my position as county sheriff to gather evidence properly. I didn't want to alert anyone at the HOA about my real job yet, so I was careful about how I approached things. First, I called the city records department. I know Linda, who works there, from our regular county meetings. The city clerk's keyboard clicks echoed like a time bomb. Linda, it's Sheriff Johnson. I need to check if any demolition permits were filed for 742 Maple Street in Pinecrest in the last month. Give me a minute to check, she said. That's weird. There's nothing here. No application, no approval, nothing at all for that address. I thanked Linda and asked her to email me the official record showing that no permits were issued. This confirmed what I suspected. Karen had ordered the demolition illegally. Next, I tracked down the demolition company. Their logo, Peterson Demolition, was on some of the equipment still at Sarah's property. I drove to their office across town. The owner, Mike Peterson, looked nervous as soon as I walked in. I wasn't in uniform, but I flashed my badge. I'm investigating the demolition at 742 Maple Street, I said. Mike immediately started defending himself. Look, I just did what the HOA ordered. They gave me paperwork that looked official. Can I see this paperwork? I asked. He fumbled through a filing cabinet and handed me a folder. Inside was a document with the HOA letterhead and Karen's signature authorizing the demolition. There was no city permit number, no inspector sign-off, just Karen's signature and a fake-looking stamp. Did you know this is illegal? I asked him. You can't demolish a house without proper city permits. Mike's face went pale. The HOA president assured me everything was handled on their end. They've used us before for smaller projects. Like what? I pressed. As Mike talked, I learned this wasn't the first time Karen had overstepped. She had ordered unauthorized removal of fences, garden structures, and even someone's newly installed solar panels. I asked Mike to provide a signed statement about what happened with my sister's house. He agreed, probably hoping to save himself from charges. Over the next few days, I discreetly interviewed neighbors in Pinecrest. Many were afraid to talk at first, but eventually shared stories about Karen's reign of terror. She had been issuing ridiculous fines, threatening homeowners, and making life miserable for anyone who challenged her. One elderly couple, the Johnsons, told me Karen had fined them $500 for having a bird feeder that wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Another neighbor, Mrs. Patel, had been harassed about her cultural holiday decorations. I compiled all the evidence, witness statements, the illegal demolition order, proof of no permits, and Mike's signed confession into a case file. Then I called the county attorney, James Martinez. We have a serious situation here. I explained everything to him. This is criminal, he confirmed after reviewing my evidence. Destruction of property, fraud, abuse of power. We're talking about serious charges. And the HOA itself could be liable for millions in damages. Good, I said. I want to make sure we do this by the book. This woman destroyed my sister's house and everything in it. James paused. Wait, this is personal for you? It's my sister's house, but that doesn't change the facts. Karen Winters acted illegally and needs to be held accountable. James agreed to prepare the legal paperwork. We had everything needed to bring Karen down. Now it was time to set the trap. To truly bring Karen down, I needed more people on my side. The HOA had a whole board, not just Karen, and I needed to know who else was involved. With some help from county records, I got the names of all the HOA board members. There were 6 of them, including Karen. I decided to approach them one by one, away from the HOA office. First, I met with Robert Chin, who worked at the local bank. I caught him during his lunch break and introduced myself simply as Sarah Johnson's brother, never mentioning I was a sheriff. I heard about what happened to your sister's house, Robert said, looking uncomfortable. That was extreme. Did you approve that demolition? I asked directly. Robert looked around nervously. I wasn't at that meeting. Karen called an emergency session with just 3 board members present. By the time I heard about it, the demolition was already happening. That was interesting. Karen hadn't even gotten full board approval. I thanked Robert and moved on to the next board member. I met with Maria Gonzalez at her flower shop. She was more forthcoming. Karen runs that board like a dictator, Maria told me. She threatened to expose some private information about my son if I didn't support her initiatives. I'm ashamed, but I've been afraid to stand up to her. What kind of private information? I asked. My son had some trouble with the law when he was younger, nothing serious. But she somehow got hold of those records and threatened to make them public. Maria's hands trembled as she arranged flowers. Now we had blackmail added to the list of offenses. The 3rd board member, Bill Anderson, was completely loyal to Karen. Everything done was perfectly legal, he insisted. Your sister ignored multiple warnings about her property. The other two board members told stories similar to Maria's. Karen had dirt on them or threatened them in some way to ensure their cooperation. Meanwhile, I reconnected with demolition company owner Mike Peterson and got him to sign an official statement about what happened. Karen told me all the paperwork was in order, his statement read. She said it was urgent to demolish the house before the homeowner returned. That last part was particularly damning. It showed deliberate timing to do it while Sarah was away. I also spoke with more neighbors. Together with Sarah, we went door to door explaining what happened. Many people were shocked and shared their own stories of Karen's bullying. She fined me $11,000 for planting the wrong type of flowers, one neighbor said. She had my children's treehouse torn down while we were at church, said another. One by one, people began to overcome their fear of Karen. I collected signed statements from 15 different homeowners documenting various abuses of power. Sarah was getting more confident too. I never thought so many people would support me, she said, as we walked back to my car after a day of gathering statements. People are tired of being bullied, I told her. They just needed someone to take the first stand. With a growing stack of evidence and statements, I went back to the county attorney. This is bigger than just your sister's house, James said, reviewing the new evidence. This is systematic abuse of power. We need to approach this carefully. We decided on a two-pronged approach: legal action against Karen personally, and an investigation into the entire HOA. By the end of the week, I had allies both inside and outside the HOA board, a demolition company owner ready to testify, and neighbors willing to speak up. Karen's power was built on fear, but that foundation was crumbling. Time to set the stage for the final confrontation. I had the evidence. I had the law. Now all I needed was to make Karen confess. On camera, I told Sarah as we prepared for the next HOA meeting. But don't worry, this time we'll be the ones in control. I wanted to confront Karen in front of everyone at an official HOA meeting, where she couldn't hide or twist the facts. I called the HOA secretary and formally requested to be added to the agenda for the next meeting. I'd like to discuss a serious matter regarding recent demolition activities, I said. The secretary sounded nervous but added me to the list. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing. I organized all our evidence into a professional presentation folder, documentation proving no permits were issued, signed statements from the demolition company, testimonies from neighbors, and photos of Sarah's demolished home. Should I finally tell them you're the county sheriff at the meeting? Sarah asked as we reviewed our plan. Not right away, I explained. I want Karen to dig herself into a hole first. We'll reveal that card at the perfect moment. I also contacted a local newspaper reporter, Dave Williams, who had written stories about local government issues before. I may have a story for you about abuse of power at the Pinecrest HOA, I told him, without revealing my position yet. There might be some interesting developments at Thursday's meeting. The reporter seemed interested. Any specifics you can share? Just be there, I said. You won't be disappointed. I made sure that all the board members we had spoken to would attend, especially those who had been bullied by Karen. Maria Gonzalez was particularly nervous. She'll find a way to get back at me, she worried. Not after we're done, I assured her. Trust me. The night of the meeting arrived. The community center room was more crowded than usual because word had spread that something big might happen. Karen seemed surprised by the turnout but maintained her usual confident attitude. Sarah and I sat in the front row. I wore casual clothes, deliberately avoiding anything that would hint at my profession. My badge was in my pocket, waiting for the right moment. Karen called the meeting to order, going through routine business first. I could see she was trying to rush through the agenda to minimize time for my item. Now we have Mr. Johnson, who wishes to address the board about a demolition matter, Karen finally announced, looking at me with clear disdain. You have 5 minutes. I walked to the front of the room, carrying my folder of evidence. Sarah gave me an encouraging nod. Thank you, Miss Winters, I said politely. I'm here about the demolition of my sister's house at 742 Maple Street, which occurred last week without proper permits, without legal authorization, and without any valid notices to the homeowner. Karen immediately interrupted. We've already addressed this matter privately. Your sister's home was in violation of multiple HOA regulations. May I see documentation of these alleged violations? I asked calmly. Karen waved dismissively. Those are in our files. We sent proper notifications. This was where the trap began to close. I opened my folder. That's interesting because I have here an official statement from the City Records Department confirming that no demolition permits were filed or approved for my sister's property. I held up the document. Demolishing a house without proper permits is illegal. The room grew quiet. I could see board members shifting uncomfortably. The HOA has special provisions, Karen began. I also have a signed confession from Mike Peterson of Peterson Demolition, I continued, stating that you personally ordered the demolition and assured him that all paperwork was in order when it was not, and that you specifically wanted it done while my sister was out of town. Karen's face began to redden. How dare you come in here and make accusations? The board approved this action. That's when Maria Gonzalez spoke up from the board table. Actually, Karen, you only called 3 of us for that vote. You said it was an emergency session. I didn't know it was for a complete house demolition. The trap was working perfectly. Karen's smirk died when I slapped the evidence folder on her pristine desk. I have 15 signed statements from homeowners in this community, I continued, all detailing abuses of power, threats, and harassment. The crowd began to murmur. I noticed the newspaper reporter taking notes furiously. A woman stood up, pointing her finger at me. This is a smear campaign. Who do you think you are? The moment had arrived. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge. County Sheriff Liam Johnson, I said, holding up my badge for everyone to see. And you, Karen Winters, have committed multiple criminal offenses that I've been investigating. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Karen's face went from red to pale in seconds. The room fell completely silent as everyone stared at the shiny metal in my hand that identified me as a sheriff. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You're the sheriff? She finally stammered, her confident facade crumbling. That's right, I confirmed, my voice carrying through the silent room. And I've been building a case about your illegal activities. I turned to address the whole room. As county sheriff, I've conducted a thorough investigation into the demolition of my sister's home. What I found was disturbing, not just an isolated incident, but a pattern of abuse of power. The newspaper reporter was frantically taking photos and notes. This was becoming bigger than even I had anticipated. You had no right to investigate us, Karen suddenly shouted, trying to regain control. This is a conflict of interest. You can't investigate a case involving your own sister. Actually, I can begin an investigation into any suspected criminal activity in this county, I replied calmly. And while I've recused myself from leading the official case due to my relationship with the victim, the county attorney's office has reviewed all evidence and agrees there are serious charges to consider. I walked closer to the board table and laid out the documents one by one. Destruction of property without permits, I said, placing down the city record statement. Fraud, I added, placing down the demolition company statement. Blackmail and coercion of board members, I placed down Maria's signed testimony. With each document, Karen seemed to shrink in her chair. My sister stood up and joined me at the front. You didn't just destroy a house, Karen. You destroyed my life's memories, photos of our parents, heirlooms passed down for generations, things I can never replace, and you did it while I was away, deliberately. One of the board members, Robert Chin, spoke up. I had no idea this was happening. Karen told us everything was being handled legally. Because you never bothered to check, an angry homeowner shouted from the back. You just let her run everything. The meeting was descending into chaos as people began sharing their own stories of Karen's abuses. I raised my hand for quiet. As of today, the county attorney is filing criminal charges against Miss Winters for destruction of property, fraud, operating without permits, and misuse of authority. The HOA itself is under investigation for potential complicity. Karen finally found her voice again. This is ridiculous. I was enforcing the rules. That house was an eyesore. I pulled out one final piece of evidence. Photographs of Sarah's house taken just a month earlier when she'd finished her garden. This is the eyesore you're referring to? I said, showing the photos to everyone. A well-maintained home that just didn't fit Karen's personal taste. Karen tried to stand up and leave. This meeting is adjourned. I need to speak with my attorney. Sit down, Miss Winters, I said firmly. You're not going anywhere yet. There are officers outside waiting to take your statement. As if on cue, 2 uniformed officers entered the room. They weren't there to arrest Karen just yet. That would come after formal charges, but their presence made it clear this wasn't just an HOA matter anymore. The look on Karen's face when she realized how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered was something I'll never forget. All her power and bullying tactics meant nothing now. You demolished the wrong house, Sarah said quietly to Karen. You never knew my brother was the sheriff, did you? Karen just stared, finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. The board voted to immediately suspend Karen pending the investigation. They appointed Robert Chin as interim president, and he promised a complete overhaul of HOA policies. As the meeting broke up, neighbors came to offer support to Sarah. The community that had been terrorized by Karen for so long was finally finding its voice. Karen was escorted out by the officers to give her official statement. As she passed me, she hissed, "This isn't over." I just smiled. "Actually, Karen, it is. You just don't know it yet." The weeks following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. The courtroom fell silent as the judge lifted his gavel. Karen was formally charged with multiple offenses: destruction of property, fraud, operating without permits, and abuse of power. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Karen hired an expensive lawyer, who tried to argue that the HOA bylaws gave her authority to take corrective action against properties violating standards. But when pressed to produce documentation of these violations against Sarah's house, they couldn't provide anything legitimate. The demolition company cooperated fully with authorities, providing all communications from Karen, including text messages where she specifically asked them to complete the demolition before the owner returns from her trip. This proved the deliberate timing and malicious intent. Meanwhile, the entire HOA was under investigation. 3 board members were cleared of wrongdoing when it was proven they'd been manipulated or threatened by Karen. 2 others faced minor charges for knowingly participating in illegal activities. The media coverage was extensive. Our local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "HOA President Demolished Sheriff's Sister's Home." The story went viral online, with people across the country sharing similar stories of HOA abuses. Sarah received tremendous support from the community. A local contractor offered to help rebuild her home at cost, and neighbors organized a fundraiser to help replace some of her lost belongings. Though nothing could bring back her family photos and heirlooms, the outpouring of support helped her begin to heal. Karen's trial was surprisingly short. With the mountain of evidence against her, her lawyer advised her to accept a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. The judge wasn't lenient. "However, Miss Winters," he said during sentencing, "you abused the trust placed in you by your community, destroyed not just a house but someone's home and irreplaceable memories. This court sentences you to 18 months in prison and payment of full restitution to Miss Johnson for her property, plus additional damages of $250,000. Karen's face was emotionless as the sentence was read, but I could see the realization in her eyes that her actions had real consequences. The HOA itself was ordered to pay additional damages to Sarah, and the county imposed new oversight regulations on all HOAs within its jurisdiction. Robert Chin, as the new president, worked with homeowners to create a more transparent and fair organization. Sarah used the settlement money to rebuild her house, making it even more beautiful than before. On the day construction began, many neighbors came to show support and help clear the remaining debris. "I never thought something good could come from this," Sarah told me as we watched the foundation being poured. "But look at how the community has come together." I nodded. Sometimes it takes something terrible to make people realize they need to stand up against bullies. 3 months later, as part of her sentence, Karen was assigned to community service. In a twist of irony, she was required to help maintain the actual community garden that had been properly established with permits and community input, next to the playground, not on Sarah's property. I occasionally drove by in my sheriff's car while Karen picked up trash or pulled weeds under supervision. She never made eye contact, but I knew she saw me. The final victory came when the county implemented the Johnson Rule for all HOAs in the jurisdiction. It required multiple levels of approval for any significant action against a property, proper documentation of violations, and mandatory waiting periods before enforcement. No single person could ever again wield so much unchecked power. As Sarah and I sat on the porch of her newly rebuilt home one evening, watching the sunset, she said, "You know, I'm almost grateful this happened." "Grateful?" I asked, surprised. "It exposed something rotten that was hurting a lot of people," she explained. "And now, because of what we did, other homeowners are protected." I smiled and raised my glass to hers. "To justice served," I said. "And picking the wrong house to mess with," Sarah added with a laugh. 6 months after Karen's sentencing, life in our community had transformed completely. Sarah's new house stood as a beautiful symbol of resilience, designed with large windows and an open floor plan. The Pinecrest HOA had been restructured under Robert Chin's fair leadership. The board now required full documentation for decisions, and held open meetings, where homeowners could voice concerns without fear. I was invited to speak at a countywide HOA reform conference. Standing at the podium, I shared our story. Unchecked power leads to abuse, but transparency and accountability can protect homeowners' rights. Other counties took notice, discussing new regulations to prevent future bullying. Karen's house had been sold to pay for damages, and her reputation was in tatters. One sunny Saturday, Sarah and I went to a neighborhood block party. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The fearful, divided community under Karen's reign was gone. Miss Patel waved me over, offering her latest culinary creation. Children laughed and rode bikes without parents worrying about petty fines. Gardens bloomed in bright colors, no longer restricted by arbitrary rules. Sarah introduced me to new neighbors who had moved here precisely because of the HOA's fresh start. As the evening wound down, she and I strolled to the community garden, now flourishing with flowers and vegetables. "Sometimes I can't believe everything that happened," Sarah said, looking around in wonder. I nodded. "It taught me that justice isn't only about laws. It's about standing up to those who wield power like a weapon." We paused in the fading light, both remembering the rubble and heartbreak Karen left behind. Yet we also saw how people had united to rebuild something stronger. "Karen never knew who she was dealing with," Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. "She was too arrogant to realize her target had a sheriff for a brother." I gave a soft laugh. Better to just not break the law at all. Together we walked back to her rebuilt home, proud of what our community had accomplished. In the end, Karen's downfall became a catalyst for change, proving that even the most entrenched bullies can be toppled when good people unite. That day, we quietly celebrated not just a new house, but a new beginning, one where nobody would again come home to find their life in shambles, courtesy of a tyrannical HOA president. Karen's mugshot flashed on the evening news as we broke ground on Sarah's new home. "You rebuilt more than a house," I told her, watching neighbors plant roses where her rubble once lay. "You demolished every excuse bullies used to hide behind paperwork." Sarah smiled, sunlight glinting off her sheriff-issued shovel. "No permits required." Neighbors gathered around us that day, watching as new beams rose from the rubble. It was more than construction. It was a testament to how a united community can stand against corruption. Sarah's eyes shone with gratitude, and I felt an unmistakable swell of pride. This victory belonged to everyone who refused to stay silent. 6 months after Karen's sentencing, life in our community had transformed completely. Sarah's new house stood as a beautiful symbol of resilience, designed with large windows and an open floor plan. The Pinecrest HOA had been restructured under Robert Chin's fair leadership. The board now required full documentation for decisions and held open meetings where homeowners could voice concerns without fear. I was invited to speak at a countywide HOA reform conference. Standing at the podium, I shared our story. Unchecked power leads to abuse, but transparency and accountability can protect homeowners' rights. Other counties took notice, discussing new regulations to prevent future bullying. Karen's house had been sold to pay for damages, and her reputation was in tatters. One sunny Saturday, Sarah and I went to a neighborhood block party. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The fearful, divided community under Karen's reign was gone. Mrs. Patel waved me over, offering her latest culinary creation. Children laughed and rode bikes without parents worrying about petty fines. Gardens bloomed in bright colors, no longer restricted by arbitrary rules. Sarah introduced me to new neighbors who had moved here precisely because of the HOA's fresh start. As the evening wound down, she and I strolled to the community garden, now flourishing with flowers and vegetables. "Sometimes I can't believe everything that happened," Sarah said, looking around in wonder. I nodded. "It taught me that justice isn't only about laws, it's about standing up to those who wield power like a weapon." We paused in the fading light, both remembering the rubble and heartbreak Karen left behind. Yet, we also saw how people had united to rebuild something stronger. "Karen never knew who she was dealing with," Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. "She was too arrogant to realize her target had a sheriff for a brother." I gave a soft laugh. Better to just not break the law at all. Together, we walked back to her rebuilt home, proud of what our community had accomplished. In the end, Karen's downfall became a catalyst for change, proving that even the most entrenched bullies can be toppled when good people unite. That day, we quietly celebrated not just a new house, but a new beginning, one where nobody would again come home to find their life in shambles, courtesy of a tyrannical HOA